Beg your pardon. Forgot to knock.
Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan are similar in some ways. They both defined James Bond throughout their respective eras, and they both had sometimes controversial runs as the super spy.
Ready to save the world again? After you, 006.
And both of them had to arguably hand over the reins to the part before they had ever truly gotten the chance to shine. And their paths to 007 intersected over and over again throughout a pretty long period of time.
Farewell to arms.
So how does that happen? What are we talking about? Well, stay with us because we're going to take a deep dive into the golden age of the series and talk about how the part of James Bond actually defined both careers long before either Timothy Dalton or Pierce Brosnan ever sipped their first vodka martinis. Shaken, not stirred, of course.
Shaken, but not disturbed.
So, for James Bond fans, these are pretty interesting times. A whole new era in the super spy's history is about to be written, with the next one that comes from director Denis Villeneuve being the first movie ever produced in the franchise outside of 1983's Renegade Never Say Never Again that didn't have the fingerprints of Eon Productions all over it.
For England, James? No. For me.
This production company, which stood for Everything or Nothing, was founded by producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, and with the exception of the 1967 spoof Casino Royale and of course Never Say Never Again, they produced every James Bond movie. Now run by Albert R. Broccoli's daughter Barbara Broccoli and his stepson Michael G. Wilson, it kept 007 as one of the most lucrative family businesses in Hollywood, and they wielded enormous control over the franchise, till that is, they were recently bought out by Amazon.
You just killed James Bond!
Who now controls the destiny of the silver screen's most iconic super spy. So now, everyone is waiting with bated breath over who will be the next to don 007's tux, to the point that speculation has run rampant. Presumed frontrunners Jacob Elordi and Callum Turner are basically unable to sit for interviews at this point without someone asking them whether or not they will be the next James Bond. That's always how it's been, though. And one person who could tell you all about that is Pierce Brosnan, who, for over a decade, probably never sat where someone didn't bring up the part, and this was long before he ever played it. But what made it worse for Pierce is that he'd come tantalizingly close to playing the role, losing it at the 11th hour to Timothy Dalton for a ridiculous reason that we'll be getting into.
Why can't you just be a good boy and die? You first. You second.
Brosnan, once he actually played 007, remembered one of the lowest points in his career being seeing a billboard of Timothy Dalton as James Bond in his first film, Living Daylights. And he admits that to this day he still cannot bring himself to watch the films, as he knew that that could have been him up there. Yet, even though he replaced Brosnan at the last minute, Dalton was far from emergency backup, with him having had his own intriguing history with the series. So let's jump back to the late 1960s, when the Welsh-born Timothy Dalton was just coming into his own as a young man in the theater. Following his Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts training, he got a big break when he signed on to play Philip II of France in one of the most acclaimed movies of the period, The Lion in Winter, opposite Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn. Another actor making his debut in the film was Anthony Hopkins, while another, Nigel Terry, would go on to play King Arthur in Excalibur.
Excalibur, I call on your power.
Dark and brooding, this was when Dalton first came to the attention of producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, who, it must be said, were casting a pretty wide net to find a new 007, with Sean Connery having quit the role following You Only Live Twice. While now any actor would probably kill for the role, this was not the case circa 1968. Sean Connery was so closely identified with 007 that many thought that anybody replacing him was doomed to fall flat on their ass. Perhaps this is how Dalton felt, but in interviews he stated it was more his age than anything else, as he was only about 22 years old at the time and felt he was far too young to play the role. And, well, he's probably right. Just as everyone predicted, George Lazenby was presumed to have fallen flat in his face as 007 in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with the presumption being that he was fired. The truth is more complicated, as Lazenby's ego went into overdrive, and having taken some very poor advice from his agent, he actually quit the role, even though Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman did in fact want him back for Diamonds Are Forever.
Never mind that. Go and get the brandy, huh?
The head of United Artists, David Picker, said differently, with him claiming that the studio had a mandate to bring Sean Connery back at any cost. Yet, sometime in the lead up to Diamonds Are Forever, it actually looked like another 007 would be launched, with American John Gavin having actually signed on to play the role. Before him, Dalton was apparently approached again, but once again he turned it down, with his career pretty hot at the time, having played Heathcliff in an acclaimed version of Wuthering Heights.
How did you think that I would feel?
How could I know?
And again, there was still a certain shadow over the James Bond role at the time, as no one actually knew whether or not it was possible to have someone succeed in the role who wasn't Sean Connery. After all, Lazenby hadn't.
This never happened to the other fella.
That all changed when Roger Moore, at 45 years old, he was actually 3 years older than Sean Connery, was hired to play 007 in Live and Let Die. The choice of Moore was interesting because he was distinctly not an unknown, but a virtual household name in the United Kingdom thanks to his long-running hit TV series The Saint, which, in its later years, became increasingly Bond-like. Moore ended up being a big hit in the role, so much so that he had a strong hold on it for the next 12 years.
You wouldn't. Not after what we just done.
I certainly wouldn't have killed you before.
By all accounts, the relationship between Moore and Eon Productions, which at this point was solely owned by Albert R. Broccoli, was pretty harmonious. But one could never say that Broccoli only had eyes for Moore. In fact, Moore almost left the series after Moonraker in 1979, and guess who the producers approached again? Timothy Dalton. By this point, Dalton was into his 30s, and his resemblance to the ideal of James Bond was actually picking up steam, with him even appearing as a character on the TV show Charlie's Angels, whom everyone kept saying looked like James Bond. Dalton actually turned down the role again, not having liked the direction that the series was going in, and another actor named Michael Billington was actually enlisted to play the role before Broccoli blinked and agreed to pay Moore the hefty salary he'd been asking for the film For Your Eyes Only.
Just being disarming, darling.
As his reign at the box office had steadily increased. As much as people don't like Moonraker now, you gotta remember, until GoldenEye, it is actually the highest grossing 007 movie of all time. While Broccoli kept returning to Dalton over and over again, it was on the set of For Your Eyes Only that Cubby Broccoli caught a glimpse of another would-be James Bond, a handsome young Irishman named Pierce Brosnan. One of 007's love interests in the film is played by a beautiful actress named Cassandra Harris, and she was actually married to Pierce Brosnan at the time, who hung around on set. Broccoli and director John Glenn, who would direct all the James Bond movies through the 80s, took note of the darkly handsome Irishman who'd made an impression the year before in a silent role in the classic British gangster movie The Long Good Friday. Apparently, Broccoli even told Harris, "He can act, he's my Bond."
She always did enjoy a good squeeze.
In fact, had Pierce Brosnan not moved to America shortly afterwards, it's possible he may have played 007 way back in 1983, with Broccoli once again not wanting to pay Moore's hefty salary. By this time, Pierce was a star on American TV thanks to playing the title role on Remington Steele, a show where over and over again people compared him to James Bond, as did the press, who likely had no idea just how close he actually was to playing the part.
Die, Bond!
I never miss.
Yet, had Sean Connery not opted to star in Never Say Never Again, it's unlikely that Pierce Brosnan would have ever gotten his next pretty close brush with 007, as Broccoli had once again hired someone else to play 007, in this case, the American actor James Brolin, who probably would have had a pretty long run. Alas, Enval felt it was a bad idea to choose this moment to launch a new Bond, and an American one at that, with Connery starring in a competing James Bond movie. No, they needed a ringer, and as such, Roger Moore once again got himself a nice paycheck to play 007 in Octopussy, a movie that people tend to forget.
A lot of vagina. Come again.
A lot of vagina.
Outgrossed Never Say Never Again at the box office by a pretty wide margin. Eon was so happy with the box office that they convinced a reluctant Moore to return for A View to a Kill, but Moore apparently had a moment of clarity when he remarked that one of the mothers of the various love interests he had in the movie was actually younger than him when he began playing James Bond, so he decided it was high time to step down. and so the hunt was on.
Such a delicate touch.
Sheer magnetism, darling.
In the year 1986, pretty much every young English actor tested to be James Bond. Heck, you didn't even need to be English, with New Zealander Sam Neill at one point a frontrunner, as was the French actor Lambert Wilson. Mel Gibson even told me when I interviewed him many years ago that he was also approached to play the role, but by then he'd already played Mad Max, and soon after would be launched to superstardom when he starred in Lethal Weapon. But Albert R. Broccoli already had his eye on who he thought the ideal person would be to take over as 007, none other than Pierce Brosnan. In the years since he'd shown up with his wife Cassandra Harris on the set of Free Rise Only, Brosnan had become a TV star in America. On NBC, he starred in the romantic comedy mystery series Remington Steele, in which he played a con man posing as a sleuth who winds up becoming the real thing, and the press just couldn't get enough of his dark Irish looks, and always, people would say over and over again, he would kill it as James Bond. Yet Brosnan wasn't the only one Broccoli had his eye on. Timothy Dalton, despite having turned down the role at least twice before, was still seen as a pretty good possibility. His career had actually kind of stalled in recent years, with his most notable roles being the love interest to an 85-year-old Mae West in a film called Sextet that thankfully has been mostly forgotten by time. He also starred in the Mel Brooks-produced horror film The Doctor and the Devils, which earned excellent reviews but whiffed at the box office. He was now stuck doing TV miniseries, starring opposite Joan Collins in the soapy melodrama Sins. Yet, he could definitely use the boost, and at about 39, he was about the right age to play Bond, and undoubtedly would have nabbed the part if only he hadn't signed on to play the love interest in a big screen version of a hit comic strip called Brenda Starr, which starred opposite Brooke Shields. If you haven't heard of this movie, well, there's a good reason for that, and we'll get to it soon. So with Dalton out of the picture, probably for the last time, attention was turned once again to Pierce Brosnan, who had recently made a feature called Nomads that, while not a huge hit, did get noticed around town, with its director John McTiernan having been earmarked for Predator. Well on the young side for Bond, being only about 33 at the time, Brosnan was called into Eon for what would turn out to be an extensive screen test lasting 3 whole days.
They'll print anything these days.
He was outfitted in a classic James Bond tux and acted out a series of classic scenes from the franchise, including the iconic seduction scene from Russia with Love, where he seduces Tatiana Romanova, and he also had to do some fight scenes. It was agreed that Brosnan really did have all the elements to play James Bond. He was handsome, but he could be tough when the need arose, so Brosnan was publicly offered the role, and he happily accepted. Yet, there was a big fly in the ointment: NBC. Even though Remington Steele was expected to be cancelled and had tanked in the ratings, he was still under contract, and when Brosnan was hired to play 007, TV executives figured they could cash on his notoriety by greenlighting another season of Remington Steele, which in turn would be reconfigured into a more James Bond-like international series. Basically, they were going to rip off James Bond, and Albert R. Broccoli wasn't having it, famously proclaiming, "James Bond is not Remington Steele, and Remington Steele is not James Bond." Brosnan, in turn, had no choice but to honor his contract, and so the role slipped through his fingers.
Thank you, Mr.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
So, the producers were once again left without a 007, but the timing would turn out to be fortuitous for Timothy Dalton. By the time he was approached again, Brenda Starr had finished filming, and the movie, simply put, was shaping up to be a major catastrophe. In fact, it would take years for it to come out, and ironically, it wouldn't even surface in North America until 3 years after Dalton's last James Bond movie. Despite all this, Dalton still wasn't sure if he wanted to be James Bond. While he had been approached and considered the part many times, he still struggled with whether or not he actually would suit the role, having never done anything like it in his career.
I take it that this is not a social call, 007.
Correct. You should have brought lilies.
He knew that once he signed on to play the part, it would forever define him, and he had also been publicly critical of the increasingly silly direction the franchise had taken in the Roger Moore years. Dalton himself said that he finally made up his mind while he was in an airport in Miami, when he picked up the phone, called the producers, and said, "Hey, I'm on board." Now, it's hard to say how Brosnan's 007 would have fared compared to Timothy Dalton's, as many say the pivot into darker territory was at the urging of the new 007 himself, who wanted to go back to the darkness of Fleming's original novels. Yet, The Living Daylights, which really is an underrated James Bond movie, does play more like it was written for someone like Pierce Brosnan than Dalton, with it pretty heavy on romance and more daring-do style action, which actually had to be toned down in the editing room. There's a scene in the cut version of Living Daylights, which could have been ripped out of a Roger Moore movie, where 007 escapes bad guys in Tangier by riding a carpet over some phone lines, making it seem like it's a magic carpet. Yes, the footage is on YouTube, and it is very embarrassing. Moore, or heck, maybe even Brosnan, could have sold that, but Dalton looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Also notable was Dalton's discomfort in other Bond-like scenes, with him awkwardly holding a cigarette whenever he had to smoke. His tailoring is also strange in the film, as when he's wearing a suit, he's probably the only James Bond to ever sport a wash-and-wear suit, which was the kind of cheap suit that was made in the 80s that you could wash at home in a washing machine and dryer without needing to press it. Yet, he did look pretty cool in a tuxedo, and the action must have been reconfigured at some point during the production, with Dalton far more vigorous than the older Moore, which is why the movie has a lot more brawling for 007, including a killer fight in an Afghan jail and another great one at the climax with the movie's henchman, Nikros, as they hang from a cargo net out of an airplane where, in a taste of things to come, Dalton's 007 coldly executes the bad guy by cutting the shoelaces from the boot he's holding onto as he begs for his life. There's also a lot more gunplay, which is something that Moore never liked doing, and in this way, The Living Daylights feels more modern as an action film than anything we'd actually seen in the James Bond series up to that point. While many assume that both of Dalton's James Bond movies flopped, that's actually not true at all. The Living Daylights was actually a significant box office success. It did fairly well in North America, with about $51 million in grosses.
Make a sound, and you're dead.
Which was on par with A View to a Kill, but less than Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, and Octopussy. Yet internationally, it outgrossed both Octopussy and A View to a Kill, so Eon and MGM UA were pretty thrilled with Dalton's debut, with him also earning strong reviews. In fact, everything seemed to be pointing at a long run for Dalton as 007, when a second James Bond film featuring him was greenlit. Everybody assumed it would be a hit, more so than The Living Daylights. This movie would be crafted with Dalton's darker approach to 007 in mind. It would also be, ironically enough, the most American-skewed James Bond movie since he went to Las Vegas in Diamonds Are Forever.
Hi, I'm Plenty.
But of course you are.
With Michael G. Wilson, the creative steward now. The film would feature villains ripped from the headlines, with Robert Davi's Franz Sanchez, a cartel leader very much in the mode of Escobar, with much of the action set in the fictional Republic of Isthmus, which was a stand-in for Panama and, of course, Manuel Noriega. It would also be much more violent than your usual James Bond film, taking a page from American action movies of the era, with a heavy dose of TV's Miami Vice worked in, as James Bond goes undercover in Sanchez's cartel as a rogue agent, who, at one point, actually has his license to kill revoked. He's hellbent on avenging the brutal maiming of his best friend, CIA agent Felix Leiter, and the murder of Leiter's bride, no doubt reminiscent of James Bond's own wife Tracy, who was killed in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with this really the third time in the franchise that her death was mentioned. Watching License to Kill now, it's easy to make a case for it being the most underrated James Bond movie ever made. Dalton's performance as 007 is one of the best in the history of the franchise, with him bringing an edge to the part that harkened back to the old Connery days.
Let me get it. No!
You've had enough.
It's the only time in the franchise up to this point, since perhaps Connery in his heyday, where Bond actually felt like he was legitimately dangerous. It also has a great villain in Robert Davi's Sanchez, while Benicio del Toro kills it in his henchman role as the young, impetuous Dario. While Carrie Lowell's Pam Bouvier remains, to me, one of the all-time best James Bond girls. But audiences in 1989 simply weren't ready for it. It was the first James Bond movie to nab a PG-13, and only after being trimmed at the 11th hour. I think American audiences rejected it because perhaps it seemed too familiar to other American action movies, and not Bond-like enough. It also came out at the worst possible time, being released in the summer of 1989, which was one of the most jam-packed in Hollywood history. This was the summer that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Batman, and Lethal Weapon 2 were all in theaters. It opened disastrously in 4th place at the box office, ranking behind Lethal Weapon 2, Batman, and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which was in its 4th week of release. And, well, it never rebounded, making only about $34 million domestically. Overseas, however, it was still a pretty big hit, earning another $121 million. So no one ever really saw it as a flop per se, but it was still considered a disappointment.
What happened?
He got the boot.
Even still, that was not supposed to be the end for Dalton as Bond. A third film called The Property of a Lady was planned for 1991 or 1992 and would have taken James Bond to China or Hong Kong or Scotland or, I don't know, any place because multiple scripts were written. Yet it was also caught up in a legal battle between Eon and MGM, which lasted for 4 years. And by the time they were ready to make a new James Bond movie, many believed simply that Dalton's time had passed. Broccoli, though, was bent on honoring the agreement that he had with Dalton, as after all, he was still under contract for another movie. But the consensus seemed to be that Dalton, knowing how much the studio was pressing Broccoli to recast, ended up taking the high road and leaving, especially considering that Broccoli was in ill health at the time and that the creative baton of the series was being passed, making it logical that the franchise would simply get a fresh start. Enter Pierce Brosnan. The years following his initial signing as 007 hadn't been the best. Not only did he have to deal with the indignity of the press always portraying him as the man who lost out in 007, but NBC actually canceled the season of Remington Steele they ordered after only 5 episodes. It was off the air months before The Living Daylights hit theaters.
Don't need the gun, Commander.
That depends on your definition of safe sex.
Brosnan tried movies with him having a pretty good role as the villain in the Michael Caine spy flick The Fourth Protocol, as well as the lead in an old-fashioned adventure movie called The Deceivers. He even tried action with the Irish flick Taffin, but the roles dried up fast, and towards the end of the decade and into the 90s, he was mostly doing B-movies and cable films. Tragically, his beautiful wife, Cassandra Harris, who of course had been in For Your Eyes Only, and to whom he was devoted, died around this time, leaving him a single father. Yet it was also at this point that his career actually started to pick up a bit of steam. He played the second lead in the successful sci-fi flick The Lawnmower Man, and New Line Cinema, who had produced the film, actually planned to launch him as an action hero with their movie Live Wire, in which he'd sport an American accent with him reworked into more of a Bruce Willis-style action star. Sadly, they dumped this pretty good flick onto cable, but then he got a great role in Mrs. Doubtfire as the very James Bond-looking love interest for Sally Field and romantic rival for Robin Williams' title character.
Help is on the way, dear! Mrs. Doubtfire! Help is on the way!
Importantly, the film's director, Chris Columbus, really liked working with him and was in fact one of the most powerful directors in town, and at the time was actually approached to direct what would become GoldenEye.
Oh, the terrorists, they ran that way. It was a run by fruiting. I'll get them, sir. Don't worry.
He passed, but he told Eon that they needed to consider hiring Brosnan for the role. Ironically, the same thing happened with the next director they tried to hire, Cliffhanger's Rennie Harlan, who told me the story himself.
And of course, at that point, Pierce had been doing a lot of TV and stuff like that, but I loved him as an actor. And I had a meeting with Barbara Broccoli and the whole gang, and I said, I think you should recast James Bond and you should, Pierce Brosnan should be James Bond. And they said, no, we are happy with Timothy Dalton and he's James Bond and that's how we want to do it. And I turned down the movie because of that. I swear to God.
So as you can see, Dalton was still attached pretty late in the game, but when he bowed out, the logical choice, of course, was Pierce Brosnan. Ironically, at around 40 years old, he had aged into a more appropriate choice for the part, and when he signed on to star in GoldenEye, the press worldwide, and fans as well, celebrated the choice. To many, he was long overdue a shot at 007, and his film GoldenEye was a box office smash, with the most successful at the box office since Moonraker.
You know, James, I was always better.
And Brosnan's 3 subsequent Bond films all were bigger and bigger hits, with Die Another Day setting new franchise records. Ironically, despite being such an amazing choice for 007, Brosnan got the worst material of any of the James Bond actors, with none of his follow-up films ever living up to GoldenEye. He pushed Eon to give him darker material, but they wanted to keep things light. When they finally decided to make a dark James Bond film, they did it without him, unceremoniously dumping him from the part.
Do you know what it does to you? Hydrogen cyanide?
What's interesting to note, though, is how, in the years since their respective 007 eras, Dalton and Brosnan's careers seem to echo each other. Of the two, I'd say that Dalton had by far a harder time escaping the role, with him reduced to B-movies by the end of the 90s. Brosnan, having earned raves for his performance in The Matador, was able to segue into more character-driven parts, but he also really struggled with typecasting. What would break the cycle for both men, interestingly enough, was TV. Dalton ended up playing one of the leads on the long-running Showtime series Penny Dreadful, which came from two James Bond veterans, Sam Mendes and writer John Logan. He then moved right into DC's Doom Patrol, and very recently earned excellent reviews for playing the villain on Taylor Sheridan's 1923, with him having finally escaped the long shadow of 007. The same thing recently happened for Pierce Brosnan, with him earning the best reviews of his career for playing his first true villain, the psychotic head of a British crime empire on Mobland, a role which oddly echoes his breakout part in The Long Good Friday. However, unlike Dalton, Brosnan, who's still a pretty strapping figure into his 70s, still gets associated with the part, with many saying that the new rights holders, Amazon, should consider doing an old man Bond movie in the vein of Logan, with him in the lead. It's unlikely to happen, but Brosnan, God bless him, knows he could still play the part in a pinch.
No one's spoken to me about it. I've heard all the rumors, and listen, they know where to find me, and let's see where the wind takes us.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.